What happened in Minnesota? We had 6 prosecutors who suddenly decided they didn't want to support the men and women in ICE. One of them was busy doing a photo shoot with the New York Times while ICE was out there risking their lives. So they came, they said, we want to resign, but we want to use our annual leave up until April, meaning they wanted the taxpayers to pay for them to go on vacation because they decided they didn't want to support law enforcement. So the breaking news tonight, I fired them all. They're fired.
It began with Pam Bondi appearing on television looking visibly frustrated, angry, and clearly under pressure as she tried to explain why 6 senior federal prosecutors in Minnesota had suddenly left their positions. The interview quickly drew national attention, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Her tone was defensive, her explanations seemed rushed, and the more she spoke, the more questions seemed to emerge rather than answers. What initially sounded like a routine personnel matter started to look like something far more serious, raising concerns about internal tensions within the Department of Justice and the stability of federal prosecutions in the region. Most people missed one crucial detail in the early coverage. These were not junior staff members or temporary legal assistants. The individuals involved were experienced federal prosecutors, some of them in leadership positions, and others highly respected line attorneys who had spent years building cases, developing expertise, and managing complex investigations.
Across the Justice Department today in both Washington, D.C. and Minnesota, a wave of resignations from top prosecutors.
So these are the senior leaders of this unit that investigates these kinds of shootings and other abuses of civil rights, potential abuses of civil rights of Americans for the Justice Department. To have an entire leadership team walk out the door roughly at the same time is unprecedented. Entire leadership team walking out the door, that's a brain drain from which the Justice Department will not be able to recover for a generation. You can't replace people with that expertise quickly.
These prosecutors were responsible for handling some of the most sensitive and complicated federal cases in Minnesota, including long-running fraud investigations that had begun years earlier under the previous administration. These cases were already in progress, already moving through the legal system, and in many instances already approaching critical stages. When multiple prosecutors tied to those investigations suddenly leave at the same time, it raises obvious concerns about continuity, stability, and the future of those cases.
It's been a mass exodus from Minnesota's U.S. Attorney's Office in the last 24 hours. The wave of resignations came after the Department of Justice pushed for an investigation into Renee Good's widow. We spoke to a former prosecutor from Minnesota's U.S. Attorney's Office who says fraud cases currently in the works will likely slow down with these departures.
When you have new attorneys that have to learn the case and start doing it from scratch, that puts you behind. Many of them are going to have to start over again, so this is not helpful for prosecuting those subsequent cases.
Bondi attempted to explain the situation in a way that framed it as a matter of discipline and accountability. According to her, the prosecutors in question had made it clear they no longer wanted to support the work being carried out by immigration enforcement officers. She claimed that several of them had expressed reluctance to assist or cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement operations, which she described as a direct refusal to support federal law enforcement. During her television appearance, she went further, alleging that one prosecutor had been involved in a photo shoot with a national newspaper while ICE officers were out in the field facing risks. To Bondi, this symbolized a disconnect between federal attorneys and the law enforcement personnel they were supposed to support. She then described what happened next. According to her account, the prosecutors approached leadership and said they planned to resign but intended to remain on paid leave until their accumulated vacation time ran out. Bondi portrayed this as an attempt to collect taxpayer-funded paychecks while effectively stepping away from their duties. She said she refused to allow that arrangement. Instead, she terminated their employment immediately.
What we're facing around the country, the deep state, in many of these offices, and we learned these people had been out there interviewing at liberal law firms prior to this. But I'll tell you what, from a personnel level, they'd be an HR nightmare. So people better look into them. They want to be part of the resistance. Yeah, bring it on. They're not going to be working for Donald Trump and the Department of Justice any longer. But that's what we're up against, not only in Minnesota, but around this country.
In her telling, this was a necessary step to restore discipline and ensure that federal prosecutors remained fully committed to the priorities of the department. She praised the recently confirmed U.S. attorney in Minnesota, describing him as capable but suddenly faced with a major personnel challenge. Bondi also framed the situation in broader terms. She suggested the resignations reflected what she called a deeper problem inside federal institutions, describing a group of officials she believed were politically motivated and resistant to the direction of the current administration. She argued that some of these prosecutors had already been exploring opportunities with private law firms before the conflict escalated, implying that their departure was part of a larger pattern of ideological opposition rather than a spontaneous protest over a specific case. In one particularly pointed comment, she referenced a prosecutor who had previously defended protesters connected to demonstrations that had turned violent years earlier, suggesting that background reflected a broader political bias. But while Bondi presented the situation as a clear example of leadership confronting insubordination, the circumstances surrounding the resignations suggest a far more complicated story. Reports from legal observers and individuals familiar with the situation indicated that the dispute may have centered around a specific criminal investigation involving the death of a woman named Renee Nicole Good. Public discussions about the case raised questions about whether prosecutors were being pressured to shift the direction of the investigation. Some critics argued that attention was being directed toward Good's widow rather than focusing more aggressively on the actions of an immigration enforcement officer involved in the incident. Bondi rejected that interpretation, insisting that decisions were being made based on evidence and legal considerations. However, the fact that multiple prosecutors chose to leave simultaneously fueled speculation that the disagreement had reached a serious ethical impasse. Federal prosecutors are trained from the beginning of their careers to follow evidence wherever it leads, regardless of political considerations or public pressure. When they believe investigative priorities are being shaped by something other than evidence, it can create an ethical conflict that becomes impossible to ignore. Inside the legal profession, mass resignations of senior prosecutors are extremely rare. Many federal attorneys spend decades building careers within the Department of Justice. They develop specialized knowledge, relationships with investigators, and familiarity with complex legal procedures that cannot be easily replaced. Leaving such positions is not a decision taken lightly. When several experienced attorneys step down at the same time, it often signals that internal disagreements have reached a breaking point. The situation in Minnesota was not occurring in isolation. Around the same time, reports began to surface about additional departures from other divisions of the Department of Justice, including attorneys working in the Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C. Journalists covering the department noted an unusual surge in resignations and dismissals over the course of the year. Some estimates suggested that nearly 2,900 DOJ attorneys had either resigned or been removed during the first 10 months alone, a number far above typical annual turnover. Later commentary suggested that the total might be approaching 3,000. Those numbers matter because institutional knowledge within the Department of Justice is one of its most valuable resources. Experienced attorneys carry with them years of case history, legal strategy, and internal accountability. When large numbers of those individuals leave at once, it creates gaps that cannot be filled immediately. New attorneys can be hired, offices can be reorganized, and cases can be reassigned, but the judgment developed through decades of experience disappears overnight. The reaction from local officials in Minnesota highlighted these concerns. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey addressed the issue publicly when asked about the impact on ongoing fraud investigations and public safety. Rather than focusing on political arguments, he emphasized a simple practical point. If prosecutors responsible for handling complex fraud cases are suddenly gone, those cases become harder to pursue. Investigations slow down, court proceedings are delayed, and enforcement becomes less effective. His argument was straightforward. Regardless of political views, fewer prosecutors mean fewer resources available to pursue crimes. While Bondi was dealing with questions about the resignations, she also faced scrutiny over a separate but related controversy involving the search of a journalist's home. The Department of Justice had authorized federal agents to obtain a search warrant targeting a reporter from a major national newspaper. The reporter, Hannah Natanson, had developed a reputation among journalists for cultivating sources inside government agencies and reporting on sensitive issues related to federal institutions. According to Bondi, the search was not intended to punish journalism, but rather to recover classified material that allegedly belonged to the Department of Defense. She stated that a former Defense Department contractor had already been arrested and jailed for leaking classified information. In her explanation, the search warrant was simply an effort to retrieve government documents that should never have left federal custody. She insisted the investigation was focused on national security concerns rather than press activity. However, critics pointed out an important policy change that had occurred earlier in the year. Bondi had rescinded a previous Justice Department memo that placed strict limits on the government's ability to subpoena reporters or seize journalist records. That policy had been designed to protect press freedom and ensure that investigative reporting could continue without fear of government retaliation. By removing those safeguards, critics argued, the department had opened the door to actions that could be interpreted as intimidation of the press. Supporters of the change argued that protecting classified information must remain a priority, especially when national security or military operations are involved. Opponents countered that once the protections for journalists are weakened, the distinction between legitimate investigations and attempts to silence critics becomes more difficult to maintain. This debate quickly merged with the broader concerns about internal dissent within the Department of Justice. For many observers, the resignations of prosecutors, the investigation involving a journalist, and the broader political rhetoric coming from leadership began to look like different pieces of the same puzzle. They raised a fundamental question about the direction of one of the country's most important institutions. The Department of Justice has historically attempted to maintain a reputation for independence, emphasizing that legal decisions should be guided by evidence and law rather than political considerations. When events begin to suggest otherwise, confidence in that independence can erode quickly. Political debates surrounding other issues added further intensity to the moment. Lawmakers were being pressed about the long-promised release of files connected to Jeffrey Epstein, a case that had already fueled years of speculation and controversy. Some representatives claimed that the Department of Justice was gradually releasing large amounts of information, while others argued that previous administrations had slowed the process by insisting on extensive redactions. The disagreements reflected the broader climate of mistrust surrounding federal investigations. At the same time, another controversy unfolded involving a worker at a manufacturing plant who publicly criticized Donald Trump over alleged connections to the Epstein case. After making those comments, the worker was reportedly suspended from his job. When asked about the situation, Representative Pat Ryan defended the worker's right to speak freely and described him as someone exercising his constitutional rights. The exchange illustrated the deep divide in political rhetoric surrounding issues of accountability, free speech, and loyalty. Returning to Minnesota, Mayor Frey also addressed a related policy debate involving the city's separation ordinance, which limits the role local police play in federal immigration enforcement. Frey argued that police resources should focus primarily on addressing violent crime and protecting public safety, rather than pursuing immigration violations involving nonviolent residents with established lives and families in the community. Critics of the policy pointed to tragic incidents in which individuals accused of crimes had previously been released by local authorities. When confronted with one such case involving a fatal drunk driving incident allegedly caused by an undocumented immigrant, Frey did not deny the seriousness of the situation. Instead, he emphasized that anyone who commits a crime should face arrest, prosecution, and appropriate punishment. His argument was that the debate should focus on allocating limited law enforcement resources effectively rather than treating immigration enforcement as the primary responsibility of local police departments. This complexity is often lost in national political discussions. It is possible for individuals to support strong law enforcement while also believing that certain strategies may undermine community trust or reduce cooperation with police. Many local leaders argue that when residents fear interaction with authorities because of immigration consequences, they may be less likely to report crimes or serve as witnesses, ultimately making communities less safe. All of these issues combined to create a sense that something larger was unfolding within the justice system. On one side, department leadership emphasized loyalty, national security, and strict enforcement of federal law. On the other side, prosecutors, journalists, and local officials expressed concern that the traditional balance between independence and political authority was shifting in ways that could damage public trust. Even individuals who support Bondi's approach must confront one undeniable reality. When experienced prosecutors leave their positions in large numbers, when journalists become subjects of federal searches, and when internal disagreement is described as resistance or disloyalty, the stability of the institution itself can come into question. The Department of Justice relies heavily on the perception that its decisions are based on law rather than politics. Once that perception begins to weaken, rebuilding confidence becomes extremely difficult. That is why Bondi's television appearances attracted such close scrutiny. Her visible frustration and determination to defend the department's actions may have been intended to project strength. Yet for many viewers, the repeated explanations and emotional tone suggested a leadership team responding to a crisis rather than calmly managing routine personnel changes. The more she spoke about the resignations, the more attention shifted from the individual prosecutors to the broader question of why so many experienced professionals were choosing to leave. Eventually, the conversation stopped being just about Minnesota or a single investigation. It became about the long-term direction of the Department of Justice and whether it could continue to function as an independent institution. When internal conflict reaches the point where prosecutors resign en masse and public officials debate the motivations behind those decisions, the consequences extend far beyond any single case. The stakes are not abstract. They influence how criminal investigations proceed, how civil rights are protected, how journalists gather information, and how the public perceives the fairness of the legal system. Trust in the justice system is built slowly over decades, but can erode quickly when political pressure and institutional conflict become visible. For now, the situation continues to develop. New details may emerge, additional resignations may occur, and ongoing investigations will eventually reveal more about the decisions that led to this moment. What remains clear is that the issues raised by these events will continue to shape debates about law enforcement, accountability, and the independence of federal institutions for a long time to come.